boring history for sleep, medieval wedding fashion of the rich, so much velvet, so little comfort. Welcome to another boring journey through history. Tonight, we're diving deep into the fascinating world of medieval fashion, specifically what rich people wore to weddings in the 13th century Europe. We'll move slowly through layers of clothing, fabrics, and customs, examining each detail with the kind of thoroughness that helps your mind settle into sleep. The revolutionary change in medieval clothing. By the year 1200, European clothing had undergone what historians consider one of the most significant transformations in the history of dress. For over 1,000 years, people had followed the Greek and Roman tradition of wrapping themselves in elaborate shawls, togas, and cloaks that were essentially sophisticated blankets fastened with fibulae, those decorative brooches and buckles you might see in museums today. But the medieval period brought us something entirely new, the concept of tailored, constructed clothing. This wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a practical revolution driven by the realities of medieval life. Picture this: a knight spending 12 hours a day in the saddle needs clothing that moves with his body, not flowing robes that catch on his equipment. Similarly, wearing a coat of mail over loose, wrapped garments was not just uncomfortable, but potentially dangerous in battle. This transformation gave us the shirt as we understand it, stockings that actually fit the leg, and even early versions of what we'd recognize as pants. It was a change so fundamental that it would influence clothing design for the next 800 years. The difference was so dramatic that a Roman citizen transported to a 13th century wedding would find the clothing completely foreign, while someone from our era might at least recognize the basic structure of medieval garments. The textile reality of medieval life. Understanding medieval wedding fashion requires grasping a fundamental fact. Nearly everything was made of wool. This wasn't a choice, but a necessity dictated by geography, technology, and economics. Cotton required a warm climate and sophisticated processing techniques that weren't available in most of Europe. Silk had to be imported at enormous expense from places like Byzantium or even farther east. Linen, while growing in popularity, required extensive processing of flax plants and was still relatively uncommon. The wool itself tells us volumes about medieval life. Most of it was quite literally homespun, produced in individual households rather than in any kind of centralized manufacturing. Picture this: in the evening, after a day's work, the women of a castle or manor house would gather to spin wool into thread and weave it into cloth. This wasn't a hobby, but an economic necessity. A single garment might represent weeks or months of work by multiple people. The quality varied enormously. Peasants wore coarse wool that was scratchy, prone to shrinking, and often poorly dyed. The wealthy could afford fine wool that had been carefully processed, sometimes even imported from regions known for superior sheep breeding. But even the finest medieval wool was quite different from modern fabrics. It was heavier, less refined, and required constant maintenance. This reliance on wool had serious health consequences that modern people rarely consider. Wool clothing worn directly against the skin could cause severe irritation and rashes. It was difficult to clean thoroughly, meaning that most people wore the same garments for weeks or months at a time. The combination of unwashed woolen clothing and limited bathing opportunities contributed significantly to the skin diseases that plagued medieval populations, from minor conditions to the dreaded leprosy. Fortunately, by the 13th century, Improvements were beginning to appear. More linen was being produced for undergarments, providing a crucial barrier between skin and wool. Wealthy families were beginning to change their clothes more frequently, perhaps every few days, rather than wearing the same garments for months. Most importantly, regular washing was becoming more common, with designated wash days becoming established routines in well-run households. The foundation, medieval undergarments. Let's start building a medieval wedding outfit from the skin outward, because the undergarments were absolutely crucial to both comfort and appearance. For men, the foundation was a pair of linen brays, essentially loose drawers that tied at the waist with a cord. These weren't fitted like modern underwear, but were baggy and practical, designed more for hygiene than appearance. Over the brays came the hose, and this is where social status began to show. Hose weren't like modern socks or stockings, but were more like fitted leggings that extended from the foot up to the thigh. They were held up by being tied to the brays or to a belt, since elastic wouldn't be invented for centuries. Picture this: a wealthy baron getting ready for a wedding might choose silk hose imported from Italy or Byzantium. The silk would be incredibly expensive. A single pair might cost as much as a farmer's entire annual income. More commonly, well-to-do men wore hose made of fine wool, carefully woven and dyed. The colors were strictly regulated by social convention: black, brown, or black, with red stripes were considered appropriate for gentlemen. Bright colors in men's legwear were seen as vulgar and inappropriate, marking someone as either foreign or of questionable taste. For women, the foundation garment was the chemise, a loose linen dress that extended from neck to knee. This wasn't just underwear, but served multiple crucial functions. It protected the expensive outer garments from body oils and perspiration, provided a smooth foundation for fitted outer clothes, and most importantly, created a barrier between the skin and the rough woolen garments that would be layered on top. The quality of linen used for chemises varied dramatically based on wealth. The finest linen came from Flanders and was bleached to a brilliant white, using techniques that were closely guarded trade secrets. This premium linen was so smooth and fine that it felt almost like silk against the skin. Poorer families made do with coarser linen that was often yellowish or gray, but even this rough linen was preferable to wearing wool directly on the skin. The pellicin, warmth and status combined. Over the basic undergarments came what was arguably the most important garment in a medieval wardrobe, the pelisson. This was a long fitted robe that served both practical and social functions. The practical aspect was warmth. Medieval buildings were drafty stone structures with no central heating, where indoor temperatures in winter might barely rise above freezing. But the pelisson was also a status symbol, and the key indicator was the fur trim. Wearing fur wasn't just about warmth, it was a declaration of social rank, as clear as wearing a crown. Picture this: even on the hottest summer day, a minor nobleman might wear a pelisson trimmed with scraggly fox fur, sweating profusely, but making it clear to everyone that he was not a peasant. The types of fur used created a complex hierarchy of status. Peasants, of course, wore no fur at all. Merchants who had grown wealthy might afford rabbit or cat fur, warm but not particularly prestigious. Lesser nobles typically wore fox or wolf, which provided good warmth and some social status. Wealthy nobles sought more exotic furs: marten, which came from northern forests and had a beautiful reddish-brown color, or the gray fur of northern squirrels, which was incredibly soft and luxurious. At the very top of the fur hierarchy was ermine, the white winter coat of the stoat. Ermine was so precious that laws actually regulated who could wear it. It was reserved for royalty and the highest nobility, not just because of its cost, but because of its symbolic meaning. The pure white color was associated with moral purity and divine authority, making ermine a political statement as much as a fashion choice. The fur trade that supplied these garments was one of medieval Europe's most important commercial enterprises. Furs came from as far away as Russia and Scandinavia, transported across thousands of miles by networks of traders. A single ermine pelt might change hands half a dozen times before reaching its final destination, with each trader adding their markup. By the time an ermine-trimmed pelison reached a wedding guest, it represented not just enormous expense, but a complex international supply chain. The bliout, artistry in fabric. Over the pelison came the bliout, the garment that offered the greatest opportunity for artistic expression and conspicuous consumption. The bliout was essentially a tunic, but calling it that underestimates its complexity and importance. For women, the bliout was often fitted so tightly that breathing became difficult, requiring assistance from servants, both to put it on and to move comfortably while wearing it. The fabrics used for bliauts tell us remarkable stories about medieval trade and economics. The most prestigious option was silk, but not just any silk. The finest came from Byzantium and was woven with threads of actual gold and silver. Picture this: a noble woman's wedding. Bliout might literally sparkle and glitter as she moved, the metallic threads catching every ray of sunlight or flicker of candlelight. There was also samite, a heavy silk fabric that medieval poets loved to describe in their verses. Samite was woven with large, colorful threads that created rich, complex patterns. It was substantial enough to hold elaborate embroidery and heavy enough to drape dramatically, making it perfect for formal occasions. A samite bliout was an investment equivalent to a modern luxury car, something that might be worn only a few times, but would be treasured for generations. For those who couldn't afford silk, there were sophisticated alternatives. Sendal was a lighter, airier silk that shimmered, almost like water when the wearer moved. It was particularly popular for summer weddings because it provided elegance without excessive warmth. Cotton, when available, was often marketed deceptively. Merchants would advertise silk at a marvelously low price that was actually high-quality cotton, woven in Sicily. The colors and patterns of bliauts were subject to both fashion and regulation. Certain colors were associated with specific social ranks or political allegiances. Blue, for example, was often the color of a particular noble house, and wearing blue to a wedding might indicate political support or family connection. The dyeing process itself was incredibly complex and expensive. Achieving a rich, deep color required multiple treatments with dyes that might be imported from as far away as India or the Middle East. The mantle, the ultimate status symbol. No piece of medieval wedding attire was more important for displaying social rank than the mantle, a semicircular cloak that was draped over the shoulders and fastened at the neck. The mantle was visible from a distance, immediately communicating the wearer's social position to everyone present. It had to be worn correctly. There was an art to draping a mantle so that it hung properly and moved gracefully. Picture this: a wealthy count arriving at a wedding with a mantle made of purple silk, imported from Byzantium, lined with ermine and fastened with a golden brooch set with sapphires. The visual impact would be overwhelming. The deep purple would mark him as someone of the highest rank. The ermine would confirm his noble status, and the jeweled brooch would demonstrate his personal wealth. But mantles weren't just about individual display. They were also political statements. The choice of color, fabric, and decoration could indicate family alliances, political loyalties, or even military service. A mantle trimmed with specific types of fur might show that the wearer had participated in a particular crusade or campaign. The length and style could indicate whether someone was a visiting dignitary or a local noble. The construction of a fine mantle was incredibly complex. The semicircular shape had to be cut from a single piece of fabric to hang properly, which meant that large mantles required enormous amounts of expensive material. The fur lining had to be carefully matched. Dozens of individual pelts might be needed for a single garment, and they had to be selected for consistent color and quality. Even the method of fastening a mantle carried meaning. Simple cord ties marked someone as relatively modest in their ambitions. A metal brooch showed more wealth and status, but a jeweled brooch, or clasp, made from precious metals, elevated the wearer into the ranks of the truly elite. Footwear, from practical to spectacular. Medieval shoemaking had reached remarkable levels of sophistication by the 13th century, offering wedding guests options that ranged from practical to utterly extravagant. The basic technology was similar to modern shoemaking. Leather was cut, shaped, and sewn to create fitted footwear that protected the feet and provided reasonable comfort. But for special occasions like weddings, shoes became opportunities for artistic expression and status display. Picture this: a wealthy merchant's wife wearing pointed shoes, made from soft leather imported from Cordoba, dyed a brilliant vermilion, and decorated with gold thread embroidery, depicting intricate vine patterns. The points might be so long that walking required careful attention, but that was precisely the point. Such shoes announced that the wearer was wealthy enough not to need practical footwear. The pointed shoe fashion, which was just beginning to appear in the 13th century, would eventually become so extreme that laws would be passed regulating the length of shoe points. But in our period, pointed shoes were still a relatively new and exciting fashion statement that immediately marked the wearer as someone who kept up with the latest styles. For the truly wealthy, shoes might be made from cloth rather than leather, an even more impractical choice that demonstrated complete disregard for durability or weather resistance. These cloth shoes were often plated with gold leaf and studded with precious stones, creating footwear that was more like wearable jewelry than practical protection for the feet. The contrast between wedding footwear and everyday shoes was stark. Most people owned only one or two pairs of shoes that had to last for years and be practical for walking on muddy roads and rough terrain. But wedding shoes could be purely decorative, designed to be worn only indoors or for special ceremonies where appearance mattered more than function. Headwear, crowns, caps, and social hierarchy. Perhaps no element of medieval clothing communicated social status more immediately and clearly than headwear. The moment someone appeared at a wedding, their head covering instantly placed them within the complex hierarchy of medieval society. This wasn't accidental. Sumptuary laws in many regions actually regulated who could wear which types of headwear. For men, the options ranged from simple cloth caps to elaborate ceremonial headpieces that were essentially crowns. A working farmer might wear a simple felt cap that provided protection from sun and rain. A prosperous merchant could afford a cap made from better materials, perhaps with some decorative elements, but a nobleman would wear something that announced his rank from across a crowded hall. Picture this: a duke arriving at a wedding, wearing what was called a cap of presence, a velvet bonnet embroidered with gold thread and set with precious stones. The cap might feature a flattened top that would eventually evolve into the academic mortarboard, but in the 13th century, it was purely a symbol of temporal power and wealth. Some of the most elaborate male headwear featured jeweled bands, metallic threads, and even small sculptures or emblems that indicated family heritage or military achievements. These weren't hats in any modern sense, but were closer to wearable art objects that cost as much as a small estate. For women, headwear was somewhat simpler in the 13th century than it would become in later periods, but it was no less significant for social positioning. Most noble women were content with their long braids intertwined with ribbons, but the quality and decoration of those ribbons spoke volumes about family wealth and social connections. For the most formal occasions, women might wear actual crowns, not ceremonial symbols of political power, but personal jewelry pieces that were nonetheless substantial investments. These crowns were made from gold and set with precious stones, often designed with intricate patterns that told stories about family history or religious devotion. The seasonal adaptation of headwear was also important. Summer weddings called for lighter coverings that provided some protection from sun while maintaining elegance. Winter celebrations required more substantial head coverings that balanced warmth with style. The ability to own different headwear for different seasons was itself a mark of wealth and social status. The economics of medieval wedding fashion. Understanding medieval wedding fashion requires grappling with the economic realities that shaped every clothing choice. A single elaborate outfit suitable for attending an important wedding could cost as much as a small farm or a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. This wasn't simply because medieval people were extravagant, but because every element of fine clothing required enormous investments of time, skill, and rare materials. Consider the process of creating a silk bliot. The silk itself had to be imported from Byzantium or even farther east, a journey that might take months and involve dozens of middlemen. The dyes needed for rich colors came from specific plants or animals found only in certain regions. The deep purple that indicated the highest social rank came from murex shells found in the Mediterranean, and producing enough dye for a single garment might require thousands of shells. The gold thread used for embroidery was literally made from actual gold, beaten into sheets so thin they were almost transparent, then cut into narrow strips and wound around silk cores. A heavily embroidered garment might contain enough gold to represent a substantial financial investment that could be recovered by melting down the threads if necessary. Picture this: a noble family preparing for their daughter's wedding might spend 2 years accumulating the materials and commissioning the work needed for her trousseau. They might pledge portions of their land as collateral to Jewish moneylenders, since the Christian prohibition on charging interest meant that most commercial lending was handled by Jewish financiers who operated under different religious rules. The pressure to maintain appearances could be financially devastating. Families often went into debt for generations to afford the clothing necessary for important social occasions. A nobleman who appeared at a major wedding dressed inappropriately might find himself excluded from future social and political opportunities, making the investment in fine clothing a genuine economic necessity rather than mere vanity. This economic pressure led to the development of sophisticated systems for sharing and borrowing clothing within noble families. Garments might be carefully maintained and passed down through generations, with minor modifications to keep up with changing fashions. Wedding outfits might be borrowed between sisters or cousins, with the understanding that such loans would be reciprocated when needed. Regional variations and international trade. Medieval Europe wasn't a unified cultural entity, and wedding fashion varied significantly from region to region. These variations weren't just matters of local taste, but reflected different trade connections, climate conditions, and political structures that shaped what was available and appropriate in different areas. In regions with access to Mediterranean trade routes, such as southern France or northern Italy, wedding guests might display fabrics and styles that reflected contact with Byzantine and even Islamic cultures. Silk was more readily available, and the patterns and decorative techniques showed influences from across the Mediterranean world. Picture this. A wedding in Venice might feature guests wearing silk garments with geometric patterns derived from Islamic art, furs imported from Russia via the Black Sea trade routes, and jewelry crafted using techniques learned from Byzantine artisans. The visual result would be quite different from a wedding in northern France, where the available materials and stylistic influences came primarily from Flemish cloth making and northern European fur trading. The Flemish regions had developed the most sophisticated wool processing techniques in Europe, producing cloth that was exported across the continent. A discerning wedding guest might specifically seek out Flemish wool for its superior quality and distinctive characteristics. Similarly, Spanish leather, particularly from Córdoba, was prized throughout Europe for its suppleness and rich colors. These regional specialties meant that truly fashionable wedding attire often represented a kind of international collaboration. Silk from Italy, fur from Russia, leather from Spain, and craftsmanship from Flanders might all come together in a single outfit. The ability to access and coordinate these international resources was itself a demonstration of wealth and sophisticated social connections. The transportation of luxury goods across medieval Europe was a complex and risky undertaking. Silk might travel overland from Byzantium through the Balkans, or by ship across the Mediterranean, and then overland through France. Each leg of the journey added cost and risk, and the final price reflected not just the value of the materials, but the enormous logistical challenges of moving luxury goods across thousands of miles of often dangerous territory. The symbolic language of colors. Medieval society invested colors with meanings that went far beyond mere aesthetic preference. The choice of color for wedding attire was a form of communication that conveyed messages about political allegiance, social status, religious devotion, and personal character. Understanding this color symbolism is crucial to appreciating how medieval wedding fashion functioned as a complex social language. Blue held special significance as the color associated with loyalty, nobility, and divine favor. It was also strongly associated with the Virgin Mary, making it particularly appropriate for religious ceremonies. Many noble houses adopted blue as their identifying color, and wearing blue to a wedding might indicate family connection or political support for the host family. Red was the color of power, passion, and temporal authority. It was expensive to produce. The finest red dyes came from cochineal insects or madder root, both requiring complex processing techniques. A wedding guest wearing deep red was making a statement about their own power and status, but they had to be careful not to outshine the host family or appear presumptuous. Purple remained the most prestigious color throughout the medieval period, a tradition inherited from Roman times when purple dye was literally worth more than gold. The production of true purple required murex shells from the Mediterranean, and the dyeing process was so complex that it was closely guarded by specialized craftsmen. Only royalty and the highest nobility could afford true purple, and wearing it was a bold claim to elevated status. Picture this. At a major wedding, you might see a careful hierarchy of colors that reflected the social relationships among the guests. The host family might wear one set of colors. Their closest allies and relatives might wear complementary shades, and more distant guests would choose colors that showed respect without competing for attention. Green symbolized youth, fertility, and renewal, making it particularly appropriate for younger wedding guests and spring celebrations. It was also associated with hope and new beginnings, giving it special resonance at weddings. White represented purity and was especially significant for religious ceremonies, though it wasn't yet specifically associated with bridal wear, as it would become in later centuries. Black served both practical and symbolic functions. It was less likely to show dirt and wear, making it sensible for travel and everyday use. But black could also represent dignity, solemnity, and sophisticated restraint. A wedding guest in elegant black garments was demonstrating refined taste and serious character. The art of medieval jewelry. The jewelry worn to medieval weddings represented some of the finest craftsmanship of the era, combining precious materials with sophisticated artistic techniques that had been developed over centuries. These weren't just decorative accessories, but were investments, status symbols, and often believed to possess magical properties that could protect the wearer or bring good fortune. Every person of social significance wore at least one ring, and often several. These rings served practical purposes as well as decorative ones. Signet rings functioned as personal seals that could authenticate documents or messages. The design carved into a signet ring was unique to its owner and was as legally significant as a modern signature. Picture this. A wealthy merchant at a wedding might wear rings on multiple fingers, each serving a different purpose. One ring might bear his personal seal for business transactions. Another might display his family arms or indicate membership in a merchant guild. A third might be set with stones, believed to have protective properties, perhaps a sapphire to guard against poison, or an emerald to preserve eyesight. The belief in the magical properties of gemstones was widespread and sophisticated. Medieval lapidaries, books describing the properties of stones, provided detailed instructions about which gems could protect against specific diseases, enhance personal qualities, or provide protection in dangerous situations. A wedding guest's choice of jewelry was often influenced as much by these supposed magical properties as by aesthetic considerations. Women's jewelry was often more elaborate and varied than men's. Wealthy ladies might wear multiple necklaces layered at different lengths, each set with different stones, chosen for their supposed protective or enhancing properties. Brooches were not just decorative but functional, used to fasten mantles and other garments. The quality and design of these brooches immediately communicated the wearer's social status and personal wealth. Many pieces of wedding jewelry came from specialized workshops in major trading centers like Venice, Byzantium, or even more distant locations. The international nature of the luxury jewelry trade meant that a single piece might combine materials from around the known world: gold from Africa, pearls from the Persian Gulf, sapphires from Ceylon, and craftsmanship techniques developed in multiple cultural traditions. hair and grooming, the politics of appearance. By the 13th century, men's grooming had undergone a significant transformation that reflected broader changes in medieval society and the influence of religious authorities on secular fashion. Earlier generations of medieval men had worn elaborate beards and long hair as symbols of masculinity and warrior status, but this was changing. The church had been campaigning against long beards for generations, with various bishops and popes declaring that excessive facial hair was associated with vanity, paganism, or even demonic influence. Pope Gregory VII had issued formal anathemas against long beards, and many bishops regularly preached that they were the sign of the children of Belial. Picture this. A wedding in 1200 would feature male guests who were almost universally clean-shaven, their faces scraped smooth by barbers, who visited the castle several times each week. This represented a dramatic change from earlier medieval practice and showed the growing influence of church authorities on secular life and fashion. The hair on men's heads was allowed to grow somewhat longer and was often arranged in small curls or waves. This required considerable attention and skill. Wealthy men employed servants who specialized in hair care and styling. The contrast between the carefully groomed hair on their heads and their clean-shaven faces created a distinctive look that marked them as fashionable and devout. For women, hairstyles were generally simpler during this period than they would become in later centuries, but they were no less significant for social positioning. Most noble women wore their hair in long braids that were often intertwined with ribbons, but the quality and decoration of those ribbons immediately communicated family wealth and social status. The braiding of women's hair was an art form that required considerable skill and time. Picture this. A noble woman preparing for a wedding might spend hours having her hair arranged by specialized servants who understood the complex techniques needed to create elaborate braided patterns that would hold their shape throughout a long day of ceremony and celebration. For the most formal occasions, women might weave gold thread directly into their braids, creating a shimmering effect that caught light beautifully. This wasn't just decorative, but represented a substantial financial investment. The gold thread was valuable enough that it might be carefully removed and reused for future occasions. The seasonal aspects of hair care were also important. Summer weddings called for styles that would be comfortable in warm weather, while winter celebrations required arrangements that could be covered appropriately with veils or hoods when moving between heated indoor spaces and cold outdoor areas. The spectacle of display. Medieval weddings were ultimately elaborate theatrical performances in which every element of dress and decoration contributed to a carefully orchestrated display of wealth, power, and social relationships. The visual impact of these celebrations was intended to be overwhelming, a feast for the eyes that would be remembered and discussed for years afterward. Picture this: hundreds of wedding guests arriving in procession, each dressed in their finest garments, creating a moving tapestry of colors, textures, and precious materials. The coordination required was enormous. Families had to plan their outfits, not just for individual impact, but to contribute appropriately to the overall spectacle without competing inappropriately with the host family or other important guests. The economic impact of these displays extended far beyond the immediate participants. The production of wedding finery supported networks of craftsmen, traders, and specialists across Europe and beyond. Silk merchants, furriers, jewelers, embroiderers, and dozens of other specialists might contribute to outfitting the guests at a single major wedding. This created a complex economy around luxury clothing that was crucial to medieval commercial life. The demand for wedding finery drove innovation in textile production, motivated long-distance trade relationships, and supported the development of specialized crafts that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible with medieval tools and techniques. The social functions of these displays were equally complex. Wedding fashion helped establish and reinforce the hierarchies that held medieval society together. It provided a peaceful way for noble families to compete for status and recognition. It demonstrated the prosperity and stability of regions and political entities to visitors from distant areas. Most importantly, the elaborate nature of wedding fashion helped transform marriage from a simple personal arrangement into a major social and political event that involved entire communities and could influence relationships between families and regions for generations to come. Getting dressed for a medieval wedding wasn't a simple matter of throwing on your best outfit. For wealthy guests, the preparation could take months of planning and several hours on the actual day. This elaborate process shows us just how much effort went into participating in high society during the Middle Ages. A countess preparing for a wedding would wake at dawn, knowing the next 3 hours would be devoted entirely to getting ready. First came an elaborate bath, much more involved than daily washing. Servants heated water and added herbs that were believed to provide both pleasant scents and magical benefits. Rose petals were thought to enhance beauty. Sage supposedly warded off evil spirits, and lavender helped calm pre-wedding nerves. The bathing happened in wooden tubs, lined with linen to prevent splinters. Servants kept the water warm by adding heated stones or fresh hot water throughout the process. This wasn't a quick wash, but a leisurely ritual that might last an hour. Multiple servants attended the bather, helping with washing, providing conversation, and beginning the long process of preparing her hair for styling. After bathing came various beauty treatments. Medieval cosmetics were quite different from what we use today, but served similar purposes. Women applied a paste made from ground almonds and rose water to whiten their skin. Paleness was fashionable because it showed you didn't have to work outdoors. These cosmetic ingredients were often expensive imports. Rose water from Damascus, almond oil from Spain, or musk from the Far East. Drying off was another elaborate ritual. Servants warmed linen towels by the fire and scented them with herbs. While wrapped in these towels, the lady's hair would be carefully combed and prepared for styling. Medieval combs were often beautiful objects in their own right, carved from ivory or precious woods, sometimes decorated with silver or gold. Combing out hair that might reach past the knees required patience and skill to avoid painful tangles. The psychology of medieval modesty. Medieval attitudes toward bodies and clothing reveal thought patterns very different from our modern views. All those layers of clothing weren't just about staying warm. They reflected deep beliefs about morality, spirituality, and the proper ordering of society. In the medieval mind, the naked body was associated with sin, vulnerability, and humanity's fall from paradise. This wasn't simple prudishness, but a complex theological understanding. Clothing was seen as both a punishment for original sin and a protection against further moral corruption. Those layers covering the body from neck to floor served as armor against both physical and spiritual dangers. When a young noblewoman dressed for a wedding, She understood that each layer of clothing created a barrier between her pure soul and the corrupting influences of the world. The chemise protected her skin from rough outer garments, but it also symbolically protected her virtue. The tight lacing of her dress wasn't just about achieving a fashionable silhouette. It was about literally containing and controlling the female body, which was considered more susceptible to sin than male bodies. This psychology influenced color choices and decorations too. Bright colors meant joy and celebration, but could also signal moral danger. Too much brightness might indicate vanity or pride. Choosing appropriate dress for different occasions required constant negotiation between necessary display and dangerous excess. Men faced similar but distinct pressures. Fashion and religious authorities demanded clean-shaven faces, representing submission to both social and divine order. Shorter hair and more austere clothing, compared to earlier medieval periods, reflected a new ideal of Christian masculinity that valued self-control over the warrior excesses of previous generations. The act of dressing took on almost religious significance. Each garment went on in a specific order, often accompanied by prayers for protection. People believed certain items had protective powers: a shirt worn by a saint, a ring blessed by a bishop, or a cloak that had touched a holy relic. These beliefs created a complex relationship between clothing and spiritual life that influenced how medieval people thought about every aspect of dress. The hidden world of medieval underwear. Medieval underwear deserves more attention than it usually gets because these hidden layers tell us so much about daily life, hygiene, and social attitudes that public clothing might hide. Making underwear was a massive but mostly invisible industry. Everyone from nobles to peasants needed undergarments, and these wore out much faster than outer clothing because they were washed frequently. A single household might go through dozens of chemises and undergarments annually, creating constant demand for linen production. In the weeks before a major wedding, seamstresses worked frantically to produce new undergarments for important guests. These weren't just replacements for worn items, but specially made pieces with subtle improvements or decorations. A chemise meant for wedding wear might have delicate embroidery at the neckline and cuffs, areas that might peek out during the ceremony or feast. Linen quality varied dramatically and served as an invisible status marker. The finest linen, imported from Egypt or Syria, was incredibly soft and could be woven so thin it was almost transparent. This premium fabric was sometimes called sandal when used for undergarments, and only the wealthiest could afford to wear it. We shouldn't underestimate the psychological comfort of fine underwear. When outer garments were heavy, restrictive, and often uncomfortable, soft linen against the skin provided a private luxury that made formal dress more bearable. Medieval accounts occasionally mention the particular pleasure nobles took in clean, soft linen, a simple comfort that separated them from common people who wore rough, scratchy fabrics. Washing and maintaining underwear took enormous amounts of time and labor. Unlike outer garments that might be brushed and spot cleaned, underwear needed regular washing with soap and water. This created logistical challenges, especially when traveling. Wealthy families might transport cartloads of clean linen to distant weddings, along with servants whose only job was maintaining the underwear supply. The geography of medieval fashion. Where you lived in medieval Europe profoundly affected what you could wear. Without our modern global supply chains, geography shaped fashion in ways that might surprise us today. Northern Europe faced particular clothing challenges. The cold, damp climate made wool production easy, but limited flax cultivation for linen. Northern nobles often imported their linen from southern regions at considerable expense. The constant need for warmth influenced fashion subtly. Northern styles involved more layers and heavier fabrics than southern fashions. A wedding in Scotland looked quite different from one in southern France. Scottish guests wore multiple wool layers, possibly including early versions of plaids that would later become clan tartans. Their cloaks were longer and heavier, designed for real protection against harsh weather. The color palette stayed muted, limited by dyes that could be produced from local plants. Southern European weddings featured lighter fabrics and brighter colors. Access to Mediterranean trade routes made silk more available, and the warmer climate allowed for less substantial clothing. Italian wedding guests might wear garments showing Byzantine influences, with complex patterns and decorative techniques learned from Eastern merchants. Alpine regions developed distinctive clothing traditions shaped by mountain life's unique challenges. Clothing needed to work for climbing steep paths, while still showing social distinctions. This led to regional styles, balancing function with display, perhaps shorter skirts for easier walking, but made from expensive materials with elaborate embroidery. Coastal cities with active ports showed the most international fashion influences. Weddings in Venice, London, or Lubeck might feature guests wearing styles and materials from across the known world. These cosmopolitan centers became fashion laboratories where different traditions met and merged into new styles. Dye availability also varied dramatically by region. Areas with woad produced excellent blues, while regions where madder grew wild had superior reds. The famous Flemish scarlet came from combining madder with Mediterranean Kermes insects, requiring complex trade relationships to bring together the necessary ingredients. The technology of medieval clothing production. Medieval clothing production used remarkably sophisticated tools and techniques, representing centuries of accumulated knowledge. Understanding these technologies helps explain why fine clothing costs so much, and why certain effects that look simple to us were actually remarkable achievements. The spinning wheel was just beginning to appear in the 13th century Europe, revolutionizing textile production. Before its introduction, all thread was spun using a simple spindle, so slow that making enough thread for one garment might take weeks. The spinning wheel increased production speed tenfold or more, though it required significant skill for consistent quality. Skilled spinners at wheels could produce incredibly fine thread. A pound of wool might become several miles of thread. This fine thread was necessary for the lightweight, supple fabrics preferred for wedding attire. The difference between coarse and fine thread showed immediately in the finished fabric. Coarse thread made stiff, scratchy cloth, while fine thread created beautifully draping, comfortable fabrics. Weaving technology had advanced considerably by the 13th century. Horizontal looms allowed wider fabrics than earlier vertical looms, and the new treadle system freed weavers' hands to work faster and create more complex patterns. Master weavers could create fabrics with integrated patterns that would challenge even modern machinery. Dyeing was perhaps the most technically complex aspect of clothing production. Achieving consistent, lasting colors required precise chemical knowledge, though medieval dyers thought in terms of recipes and traditions rather than science. The process typically involved multiple steps: preparing fabric with mordants to help dyes stick, then actual dyeing, which might need multiple baths for the desired color depth. Different fibers needed different dyeing techniques. Wool absorbed dyes readily, but could be damaged by excessive heat or harsh chemicals. Silk was more delicate, requiring gentler handling, but achieving more brilliant colors. Linen was notoriously difficult to dye and often remained natural colored or only lightly tinted. Cutting and sewing tools were equally sophisticated. Medieval scissors were precision instruments from specialized workshops in cities like Milan or Nuremberg, where metalworking traditions produced exceptional quality tools. Needles were equally important and specialized, different sizes and shapes for different fabrics and purposes. Clothing construction required surprising mathematical knowledge. Creating properly fitted garments meant understanding geometry and proportion. Pattern pieces needed careful calculation to minimize waste of expensive fabric while ensuring proper fit. Master tailors guarded their knowledge carefully, passing it down through apprenticeships that might last a decade or more. The social rituals of wedding preparation. Beyond individual dressing, medieval weddings involved elaborate social preparation rituals that brought together entire communities and reinforced social bonds. These rituals began weeks or months before the ceremony and involved complex negotiations of status, precedence, and mutual obligation. Selecting wedding attire was rarely an individual decision. Families held conferences to discuss appropriate dress for different members, considering not just personal preference but family honor and political implications. A noble family might gather in their great hall with fabric samples spread across tables, debating whether their finest silk might overshadow the bride's family, or whether less impressive attire might seem insulting. Lending and borrowing clothing and jewelry for weddings created complex webs of social obligation. A family might lend their finest cloak to a cousin for a wedding, expecting this favor to be returned later. These loans required careful negotiation. Borrowed items needed to suit the borrower's status without appearing to claim higher position than they actually held. Preparing wedding clothes often became communal activities, strengthening bonds between women of different households. Embroidery parties brought skilled needlewomen together to work on wedding garments while sharing gossip and reinforcing social connections. These gatherings served multiple purposes: sharing technical knowledge, providing entertainment during long hours of detailed work, and creating witnesses to the effort and expense invested in preparations. For younger family members, wedding preparations provided crucial education in social norms and practical skills. Girls might begin learning embroidery by working on simple decorations for relatives' wedding clothes, gradually taking on complex tasks as skills improved. Boys accompanied fathers to select fabrics or commission jewelry, learning to judge quality and negotiate with merchants. The final days before weddings saw intensified activity as garments were completed, pressed, and carefully packed for transport. Special chests protected valuable clothing during travel, often lined with herbs, believed to repel insects and prevent mildew. Packing required skill. Garments needed specific folding to minimize wrinkles, and different fabrics required different handling. The night before, final preparations. The evening before a medieval wedding filled with final preparations going far beyond simply laying out clothes. This time of intense activity, anxiety, and anticipation involved entire households, ensuring everything would be perfect for the great occasion. Picture this: the castle or manor house, illuminated by hundreds of candles, as servants and family members hurried through final preparations. In wardrobe chambers, Clothing received final inspections. Every seam was checked, every decoration examined for security. Minor repairs happened. A loose pearl reattached, a small tear mended with tiny, invisible stitches. Pressing garments without modern irons was complex. Smooth stones heated in fires might be wrapped in cloth and carefully applied to remove wrinkles. For delicate fabrics, garments might hang in steamy rooms or stretch on frames. The goal was making every garment look fresh and new, despite potentially being in storage or transport for days. Jewelry was polished with special cloths and compounds. Gold might be burnished with agate stones for luster. Gemstones were cleaned with wine or vinegar for proper sparkle. Settings were checked for loose stones. Losing a valuable gem during festivities would be both financially devastating and socially embarrassing. Accessory preparation was equally important. Belts were polished, buckles shined, decorative elements secured. Shoes were cleaned and treated with oils for supple, attractive leather. For cloth shoes, special care ensured they stayed pristine, as any staining or damage would show immediately. Hair preparations began the night before, too. Women washed their hair with special preparations believed to enhance luster and manageability. Various treatments were applied: egg whites for shine, herbal rinses for color enhancement, or oils for easier braiding. Hair was partially styled in ways allowing quick completion the next morning. Psychological preparation matched physical preparation in importance. Families discussed the upcoming event's social dynamics. Who would attend? What alliances needed reinforcement? What potential conflicts to avoid? Young people were coached on proper behavior, reminded of family honor, and instructed on subtle signals indicating when to approach or withdraw from social situations. The morning of the wedding, the grand assembly. Medieval wedding mornings began before dawn with carefully orchestrated sequences ensuring every participant was properly dressed and ready. This process required military precision and coordination, especially for large weddings involving hundreds of guests. As first light appeared, servants began heating water, preparing breakfast, and laying out preserved garments. Kitchen fires were stoked for hot water and warmth in dressing chambers. In wealthy households, specific servants were assigned to assist each important family member with dressing. Dressing order was hierarchical and practical. Servants and lower-ranking family members dressed first, as they'd assist their social superiors. This created a rolling wave of activity, as each rank prepared in turn. Timing was crucial. Everyone needed readiness for the formal church procession, but highest-ranking members couldn't dress too early, or elaborate garments might become disheveled. Actually, dressing a noble lady for a wedding could take 2 hours or more. First came careful washing and body preparation, then the chemise, which had to lie perfectly smooth and properly positioned. Hose came next, carefully rolled up legs and secured with potentially decorative garters. Each layer added complexity and time to the process. Conclusion: the legacy of medieval wedding fashion. As we reach the end of our journey through the elaborate world of medieval wedding fashion, we can appreciate how these clothing systems represented far more than simple vanity or display. They were complex languages of social communication, economic networks that spanned continents, and artistic traditions that pushed the boundaries of medieval craftsmanship. Every thread told a story about trade relationships, political alliances, religious beliefs, and social aspirations. From the humblest linen chemise to the most elaborate fur-trimmed mantle, medieval wedding clothing was designed to communicate precise messages about identity, status, and relationships within the intricate web of medieval society. The investments that families made in wedding attire represented not just personal expenses, but essential tools for navigating the complex social and political networks that determine success or failure in medieval life. The ability to dress appropriately for important occasions could open doors to advantageous marriages, political alliances, and commercial opportunities. Understanding medieval wedding fashion also helps us appreciate the enormous changes that have occurred in how we think about clothing, identity, and social relationships. While we still use dress to communicate aspects of our personalities and social positions, the rigid hierarchies and explicit status markers of medieval clothing have largely disappeared from modern life. The next time you attend a wedding, you might consider how we still use clothing to show respect, celebrate relationships, and participate in communities, though perhaps not quite as elaborately as those medieval nobles who gathered in their silk and ermine to witness ceremonies that were as much about politics and economics as they were about love and commitment. Sleep well and dream of golden threads woven into ancient patterns, of precious furs that traveled thousands of miles to reach castle halls, and of crowns that caught candlelight in stone chapels where every garment was chosen to tell a story about power, wealth, beauty, and the eternal human desire to belong and be recognized in the grand theater of social life.